Okay, hi everyone. I'm hoping everybody can hear me and see the first slide that says UI UX design.
Yep, we can hear and see you.
Awesome. Thank you for the feedback. All right, thanks everyone. Super excited to see so many of you interested in learning about UI UX design. It's sort of a huge area. I was thinking, well, I'm going to go over some of the basics, the principles, the guidelines, and essentially what it entails, what kind of jobs exist in this space out there, what's the difference between UI and UX, and what kinds of things people do. Feel free to interrupt me if you have questions as I'm going through, or if you want to wait until the end, that's fine too. I'll hang out after talk and answer any questions y'all might have. Okay, all right. So I put a link up here to my research lab in case anyone's interested in taking a look at what I do. Just as a way of self-introduction, my name is Misha, and I joined the UCSB CS department faculty last fall. I graduated from MIT a couple of years ago, and most of my research has been looking at new types of interaction mechanisms in virtual and augmented reality. All right, so the design process essentially consists, and this could be true of all kinds of design processes, not necessarily in the context of what we're going to talk about. But mostly, let's say when we're talking about UI UX design, the conversation today is going to sort of stay focused on either web or app design, right? So you start out, of course, you need to have a problem to solve, a website or an app to make, and you start out with doing the research. And that's how you come up with ideas, right? It might be something in your own life that you've noticed that, oh, it'd be cool to have an app that lets students at UCSB find, maybe not right now with COVID, but generally quiet spaces to go study, and you decide to build an app. And so that's an actual problem you observed in your community and came up with a solution to it. And then the rest of the process happens after that, now that you've identified what is it that you want to do. And it could be anything, family, restaurant, website, or your own portfolio, or any of those things. Right. So you start out with the research. The next stage is, of course, you build a simple prototype, which has multiple stages. Like you could build a wireframe, which I'm assuming maybe some of you attended the Figma session and learned how to do wireframes. And there's many other tools that help you build wireframes, which are also clickable. So it also actually feels like you're going through the real motions of going through an app. And it's at this prototype stage where you start thinking about how to design. And the design means it's not just where to place a button on your screen. I mean, that is an important aspect of it, but it's also the overall architecture of the app or the website, and why you want to have such an architecture, how you want to have menu systems, what kind of menu systems, what are things that you should use that other apps and websites are using, and what are things that are new that you want to introduce that nobody's ever seen before. And these are the times, once you build a simple prototype and you follow some design principles to build it, then you do some testing. And that's when you have real people come in and look at your app or your website. And based on whatever you learn, you go back, make changes, and then you test again. And then eventually you deploy. And once you deploy, then you continue maintaining updates, you support the system and answer questions, and over time also keep adding new features. All right. So, broadly speaking, in the context of web or app design, and I'm just going to say app design, just so I don't keep repeating web or app over and over, it essentially entails interaction between three main elements. There's some design theories, there's principles, and then there's guidelines. And I lay them out because they go from more general and broad to more concrete as they go down, right? And theories could be based on, essentially, it could be a cognitive theory, a perceptual theory, it could be how humans are, something as basic as that. So theories are really broad in general. Principles are more like rules of thumb, so they also give you a way to analyze. Once you build something, go back and actually figure out how well your system is working, right? So you can see how effective an interface is, whether people are able to do the things that they want to do using your app easily, quickly? Is it helping them, and all those things? And then there's different kinds of rules of interface design that you want to follow, which also falls into sort of a principle. And we'll look at these in more detail in a few minutes. Things like, how can you prevent errors in your app? And I'm not really talking about errors like, you click a link and you get a 404. I'm mostly talking about errors that people might make while they're trying to browse through your design because they misinterpret something that you put in there as something else. And simplicity and there's many other principles, and we'll go through them. And then lastly, guidelines. As I said, just things get more specific as you go down. So guidelines are actual things that you can apply to your design when you start building something, like organizing elements on your screen, or not using blinking text, which is something, designers have learned over time, because back in the 90s or early websites used to have a lot of blinking, flashing text, and nobody really knew or figure out what to pay attention to since everything on the screen was blinking. And so guidelines evolve over time, as do principles. Like, everything changes because people also are changing. People are also learning, and some things are becoming some base knowledge of how to interact with these apps or websites and tools, right? There's also a chance that guidelines can at times be wrong, right? Things just become common knowledge over time, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's also the perfect thing to do. So this is sort of becomes an opportunity for designers to introduce new things into their design, which, if adopted by many, many others because it makes sense, they're easy to use and intuitive, then they become a guideline at some point, right? So on every slide, you will see a link at the bottom, and I put in an image over here above this link because this content is coming. I pulled out from this slide deck of about 96 slides, just in case you want to take a look at it. And there's references to everything that's throughout this talk. All right, so let's start with principles. As I said, these are more fundamental, they're more broadly applicable, and they last longer than guidelines. And guidelines change mostly because devices are changing. So you'll have different guidelines for, let's say, a watch versus a phone versus a tablet and your laptop screen. And those might change as device sizes change, resolutions change, maybe the interaction methods change. Sometimes you're now interacting with speech and you're talking to your devices, which wasn't really true many years ago. And so the design guidelines now include adding a spoken option to a lot of apps, which didn't used to exist, right? So, but the design principle behind it would just be to allow people to interact in the most obvious, most intuitive manner with your design system. So principles have some, principles revolve around the user, essentially, and then what the user wants to accomplish. So the first thing we just talked about is you want to find a problem to solve, a problem that is important to a particular user group that needs solving. And I put in empathy here because the way to find problems to solve is essentially to observe, sort of be aware of what people are doing around you, what kinds of things people are complaining about or wishing they had or looking for. And those are your opportunities to figure out what might be solvable with an app, right? And the next thing is, of course, determining what is your audience group. So let's say if it's UCSB students and you're mostly targeting undergrads, right? And you have a sense of most everybody has used a phone, has an app, or used an app before. So you sort of have an established baseline of what your app could look like because you understand that people have this general awareness and familiarity with using apps on their phones. So you use a map, you can, use gestures or tapping or double clicking, sliding, slipping, any of these things that you think people are familiar with. And that's important because and we'll get a little bit into more detail about user analysis, is you want to understand, you want to design not just for people who are using the app for the first time, but also people who are using your app over and over. And those are two completely different experiences, and they need to be designed differently, right? And then, of course, what is the tasks that the user wants to accomplish with their app? And then principles also include, interaction styles. What are the different ways that people will interact with a designed app? And then there's rules of interface design, etc. All right, so let's take a look at some principles like user analysis. And this is an old principle. You can see it comes from Hanson's work in 1971. And so it's not necessarily only, started since the iPhone came out in 2007, just because we had touch screens that all these designs suddenly came into being. The principles are much older because we've been designing digital systems for much longer than the touchscreen based devices that we now have, right? So the first important thing is you got to know who your user is, like we were just saying, UCSB students possibly. Then knowing your user gives you a sense of their age, their abilities, what kind of backgrounds they might have. So that gives you information on what kind of language to use on your designed app, how to build it, what kind of metaphors possibly to use, and what kind of other interaction mechanisms to use that you think people might be familiar with. Right. And so you want to have different design goals based on people's skill levels. Like I said, a first-time user may just be figuring out how to use the app and trying to understand what it's for. But someone who uses it all the time and knows, you may want to have some shortcuts for that person to get to the information they're looking for, instead of having to go through all the steps that they had to the first time around they use your app. So there's that difference between types of users, right? The expert users, there's the novice users, and then there's some in-between users who understand how things work, but they don't use your system quite as often. So maybe you need to support them slightly differently because they're not quite the expert users, but they're also not novice yet anymore. All right. So another thing was, you figured out who your audience is, right? And you figured out, okay, these are different ways I need to design for different types of users because these are who I expect to be using my app. Then you want to figure out what kinds of tasks do I want to enable people to do with this, right? If people are able to, let's say, look for a quiet space, then the next thing you have to think about is, okay, how should they be able to reserve this quiet space? Where is that schedule coming from? Is there some other service? Does UCSB have a website for reserving things? Is it just paper sign up right now? Is there a way, let's say someone wants to get food delivered to this quiet space. Is there a way to plug into a food delivery service and then have a way of telling them? Will they be able to enter the building? Like all these other things now start unraveling themselves once you sort of have a basic idea and what else you want to build. And then at this point, you also want to question and find out, what is it that the app really wants to do? And that again comes from brainstorming and again, better understanding of who your audience group is and why you think they might want to use your app over something else, right? So the goal again starts with the user. I mean, this is user interface, right? User experience design. Everything is user focused. So you start with understanding what a user's goals are. What kinds of things would they do to achieve these goals? Like, how do people look for these quiet spaces to study in on campus right now? What is missing that an app could actually fill in for? So understanding experiences, previous knowledge, and being an individual who is part of this audience group, your own opinions also matter a lot because you are sort of living the experience of someone you're designing for. And so there's different ways of doing the task analysis. There's of course the whole formal processes of doing it, but there's also so if you look at the usability.gov website, you can sort of get an overview of what or how these might be done. So in terms of resources of what happens when you want to build something new, how to even figure out the whole process, what to do. Tons of resources out there. As I said, each slide more or less has a link to some reference. Okay, does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. I see some questions. Can someone moderate and please read them out to me?
Yeah.
I think nothing, like no questions so far.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone was just saying that it's good for them.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so I mentioned earlier in principles, right? There's 5 interaction styles, and those can be broken down into these categories that I list here. First is direct manipulation, and this we do that, of course, now we do it with touch screens, but this also applies to using a mouse. You are directly, for example, dragging and dropping. You are actually manipulating the entity that you want to manipulate. You can pick something up and drop it elsewhere. So it doesn't matter if you do it touch-based or mouse-based or trackpad or something else, right? And for that matter, well, now we do it in VR. We do it with hand controllers or without controllers, just with hand gestures. Menu selection is another way of designs. And this is sort of, these things came by when graphical user interfaces came into being. So menu selection, so y'all are familiar, you just have drop-down menus and you can go from one step or one part of a website, let's say from the home page to another part, just by going through this menu options. And usually you put those in because you don't want to overcrowd your home page or your home screen. You just don't want to put everything that your app does there because that's too much information. You sort of want to lead people through these multiple paths that they could follow because they are there to do different tasks and they want to achieve different things and they have different abilities, and you want to sort of build this pathway for them to follow. Right? Form filling is another type of interaction style where you're essentially entering data onto a website or an app. And again, it isn't, forms, I think, can still be very frustrating despite automatically moving your cursor and automatically checking content and everything else. Forms are generally a pain point. At least I find them still be a pain point in design. Then command line, of course, it might appeal to expert users. It might appeal to users who are more familiar with it and have been using it for a long time. And it has its own level of cognitive burden, right? So this is sort of a matter of, again, who you're designing for. You may want to build a command interface because that's who the audience is. And, then you have to think about whether it makes sense to do it with a touch screen, how much can people type, and all those other things come into play after. And then the most recent one is natural language, right? So spoken interfaces. You can talk to your devices, but they have their own limitations. They'll understand some things, they may not. Then how do you correct? Or it's just, you can do only so much with these interfaces. So they're also evolving just because they're sort of more recent than the other ones. All right, so this is sort of another set of principles. These are older than the ones I just was talking about. Point being that we're gonna see many of these things, right? Principles and guidelines. Different people have provided each set over the years, and there's quite a bit of overlap between these. So I just wanted to give you another example of, okay, we've looked at a set of principles. Here's another set of principles that Beaufort Hanson came out in 71. And some of these principles, interestingly, you will see are actually more guidelines as we go down, right? The error management and optimizing the user's task. And you don't want a user to rely on memory when they're using your system. You want to rely on recall. Recognition over recall's memory. Recognition over recall is what you want to follow as a guideline. So, all right. Again, here's a link to it if you want to take a look. All right, so that was just principles. Like I said, big, broad things, more fundamental, longer lasting. And then now we're going to talk about guidelines. Design guidelines, again, in the context of app or web design. These are sort of best practices that have filtered up over the years by, tons and tons of apps and websites being designed over time out there, and people are using, and all of them, most of them usually have user studies before they go out, and then they collect a lot of data about user behavior. Like everything is recording everything, I imagine, all the time. And that's how they're using the data. Not only, of course, there's data used for advertising, but there's also data used to see what you were doing in the app and where you got lost and how did you backtrack and how did you figure out what to do and all those things. Those help them update things. There's people who are critics of guidelines and say they are too specific and they're difficult to apply and they can be wrong at times. And then there's proponents of guidelines who say that they sort of encapsulate valuable experience of other designers, and then they give a way for people who are now learning to actually have something to hold on to, something more tangible that they can actually more concretely, write code and put it into their design system. Apple and Google and I think Microsoft used to have them. I couldn't find their guidelines. Actually, no, I did. All big companies have their design guidelines because these are very specifically also, as you can notice, related to their own devices, and they want certain things possibly followed, but they design their own apps and they also know how to do what works well for their systems. So here's sort of a quick example of an Apple guideline, right? And these are human interface guidelines. So this is sort of a screenshot of the app. And I just picked one. I'm looking at a Mac OS design, and I'm looking at user interaction, and the specific type of user interaction guideline I'm looking at is data entry. And here it talks about, it doesn't matter if you're using a keyboard, a mouse, or trackpad, data entry is generally error prone, and you want to try to minimize or help the user, give them enough information, tell them that this is incorrect or whatever's happening. Right, so this is sort of a very concrete guideline, and they show you visuals so you can sort of get a sense of, okay, this is what I might want to do if I have a form like this in my app where somebody is entering their email address, right? Here's some example guidelines from Google. These are very specifically mobile device related, right? I'm specifically looking at what's called components, which are essentially building blocks for creating the whole app user interface. And in this example, I'm looking at this bottom bar. And you wouldn't think there'd be so much to a bottom bar, but if you start looking at it on their website, there's a ton of stuff just for that bottom bar design, right? Like right now, there's, okay, we'll look at it. There's, let's look at the next screen. So here's a bottom bar, right? It displays, there's navigation elements, there's a search, there's a menu here, and both will do different things, and there's a button that will do different things. So this is sort of the breakdown of this whole bar, right? You got your container, you have a navigation drawer, you got a floating action button, you got an action icon, and some overflow menu. And then these bottom bars have very specific usages, or at least the ones that Google's putting on their website. You could have for navigation, you can have floating action button for something that pops up. You could have all the ways of using bottom bars to access aspects of your app. And then you have different ways of adding themes to your bottom bar, right? So if you look at this bottom right image, this floating action button, this could cause any action to happen, right? And in the theme, it's causing the camera to open up. And then you have a search, and then you have your navigation drawer control, but the theme doesn't have this overflow menu control. So this changes, of course, and those are design-based. Whatever your app needs to happen, happens, right? And they have other details like how many pixels this should be for whatever type screen, whatever resolution screen. So it's actually touchable and it's not too thin or too big, taking up too much screen space, and all of those things, how many pixels the icons should be, and all these things are listed. Right, so they have their own set of principles in these design guidelines, right? So as I was saying earlier, there's a little bit of fluidity between the two guidelines and principles. So here you can see that the principle, general idea behind this is it needs to be an actionable, this floating button, or even the whole bar. And then it's flexible, so design can change, the floating action button can move around. And then it needs to be ergonomic in the sense that, as device screens keep getting bigger and you still want to interact with one hand, you have to place it within reach of either your thumb, left or right hand, however you want the user to use it, or give them options. All right, so I found online an example website from 1997. Right, and you can see where the guideline for don't use blinking text on your website sort of came from. And most websites back then, I believe, look like this, right? So this is a website for photorealistic 3D graphing software for math and physics visualization. But I don't know what to pay attention to. There's too much stuff happening. All right, so I put that in thinking or hoping maybe this joke's not lost on you. This is XKCD. Okay, moving on. Right, so far, we've only talked about user interface, right? And I'm separating out into user interface being more focused on the visual design of an app or website, on the layout, on the navigation, whereas UX, which is the user experience part of it, is more focused on usability testing, user research, personas, mental models, trying to understand the user that you're designing for, whereas this is the actual doing the designing, right? And this can change depending on where you're working in this space, because some companies might have the same person doing both these things. Some companies might have different people doing these things. All right, let's take a look at user interface. And actually, I want to be mindful of time. How much time do I have, Spencer?
It's 7:04 right now. Probably like 30 more, like half an hour still. So you're probably good.
Yeah, I might want to speed up a little bit. All right, so user interface. We all know that this is the means by which we as humans are interacting with digital content or digital systems. And doesn't matter what system it is, every system has an interface, from thermostats to remote controls. Whether it's a physical interface, it's still an interface, right? So we just talked about there's GUI and CLIs, graphical user interface and command line interface, tangible or tangibly touch-based user interface. Well, touch and tangible, slightly different, but point being there's something physical that you're interacting with when you're interacting with digital content. And by physical, I don't just mean it's the glass screen that you're touching on your phone. If you're interacting, it could be some other tangible device, like let's say a game controller. It gives you haptic feedback, you have actual buttons, and it's a tangible controller for digital game characters, right? And speech-based and spatial interfaces, specifically AR and VR. Right? And interfaces are essentially composed of layers. You got the human-machine interface. So what is happening at the top level? The hardware is involved in it. There's output mechanisms and there's input mechanisms. And again, these are sort of going back one level up from the actual device screen that you're holding on to, right? There's a larger space of what kinds of interfaces exist. Interfaces need to be functional, of course. They have to do the job that they're built for, and they need to be reliable and work every single time the same way. They can't be continuously changing so that you're always surprised to, I don't know how to get there, but I did yesterday. They need to be usable, user-friendly, need to be easy to figure out, and they also need to be fun, right? You want to enjoy it. And I think if you think about the apps that you use and spend a few minutes thinking about which one seems the most intuitive, it will be the interface that you'll find either fun to use or easier. It just all makes sense to you. And of course, the tasks that it allows you to do, whether it's ordering food or talking to friends or whatever it is. But the interface sort of needs to make sense. So now we come down to 8 golden rules of interface design. This is, there's the link for it at the bottom. It says Professor Ben Schneiderman. And these have come into being over time. I'm going to go through these. I might go a little bit quickly through these since you can always look at the website for more details. But ask me questions if you want me to pause more on any one of these, right? Let's see. First thing, consistency. And there's multiple levels of consistency that need to happen in your design. There's lexical consistency, which, could be consistent not just from one screen to the next screen in your own app, but also how your app is consistent with other apps, just like we were looking at the bottom app bar in Google's material design guidelines, right? There are some standards and there's some standardized icons, and people know that a volume slider looks like this, but if you make it different in your app, you should have a really good reason why yours is different, because that's not what is the expected thing to do. So it's sort of a little bit of a trade-off between, every app shouldn't look exactly like every other app. That's not what really the guidelines are asking you to do, but at the same time, there's definitely a lot of room for creativity. That's how these things even started in the first place, right? Somebody built it the first time around and then it became a thing. But at the same time, you want to see what makes sense. And maybe there's another intuitive way, like knobs or something, who knows, of doing volume. So syntactic consistency, you want things sort of located at the same place in your app every time a person looks at it, or across screens also. And then there's semantic consistency. The meaning of the icons and things that you use should be consistent. All right, we're also looking at your app or whatever you're designing sort of needs to work across many different devices now. It can't just work on a laptop and totally fail on a phone, because you don't really know how people, eventually you learn by tracking, but originally you don't know how people will most likely access unless you do some surveys and try to understand your audience group and things like that.
Professor Shah, we have a question.
Yeah.
Alex asks, could you clarify what you mean by operations are equally valid for different objects? And I think this might be on about the previous slide.
Right here.
Yeah.
Oh, so this means the meaning of the icon or the element that you're using should be consistent. It's like, let's say, I'm trying to think of an example. I'm mostly thinking about when you have an app and you want, I don't know, some particular icon you're using on your homepage, which is not a standardized icon, right? It's like these ones from music and places and things that sort of become commonplace. A lot of apps use them. When you click on that icon, it should do the same thing when clicked in one place than when clicked in another part of your app. Does that help?
Yeah, she says that makes sense.
Okay, right. And there's this link down here and also offer a lot more details. This one, the first one, the HCI principle PDF. The material IO is these visuals. All right, so like I said, universal usability is sort of an ideal. It's really, really hard to achieve, but you want to strive for it to get your system functional for as many different types of users as possible. Right. Okay, let's move on to the next one. You want to provide people with informative feedback as they're using your app. I mean, a lot of these things sort of almost might seem obvious, but once you start designing, it takes thinking to remember to put these in your app, because it just seems obvious in your head. And when you're a user, when you're a designer, you're thinking quite differently about the same problem, right? So you want to keep people in the know every step of the way. They sort of need to know what they're doing, what's going to happen when they press a button, and whatever else. Like for this example here, you're uploading something to Dropbox, and it gives you many options and feedback. It tells you, how much time is left in approximation. It tells you the file name you're uploading, tells you where it's coming from. It fills out this bar visually. So the same information is presented in more than one way because you don't know how somebody will look at this and take what from it. And I know I'm saying you don't know, but there's obviously ways of doing usability studies to try to understand better how people interpret these things. And that's where all this information also comes from in the first place.
Natalie's asking if you could go back to rule 2 for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's just wondering if we, since we glossed over the right side of rule 2 when we were answering the question for the left for rule 1 about operations are equally.
The reason I did that is I figured I'm sort of in the interest of time. I'm going through these a little bit faster than I would have, but I'm hoping since this is being recorded that you'll actually have access to the slides and the links and you'll be able to access more information. So
yes, yeah, the slides and recording will be available on our website after.
Yeah. So, if you have specific questions, I'm happy to answer, but I'm also trying to get through stuff. I mean, I could go slower if you guys would prefer just to stop and just go into details on each rule. That's fine with me too.
I think right now, the pace is good. And if we have any questions, then I'll just let you know.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'm not really going over every single thing on every slide. Sorry about that. Just trying to get the big picture idea of what these things mean, right? So this one, closure essentially means the user should have a sense of when whatever task they started doing on your app or your site actually ended. And there has to be a way of telling them that they are done. It's like in a shopping cart, right? You put things in your cart, you go through the whole checkout process. Eventually it tells you, message says, okay, you're done. It's over. And you will get an email telling you whatever you just purchased. And it started in a whole process. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and then there's an end. It's almost like a story arc that you want to have all aspects of it in place. And then this has examples of, there's different scales of closure, right? Shopping cart is a big example. Downloading or uploading something is a whole nother example. It's sort of one aspect of what you're trying to do. Okay, this is an important one. I mean, they're all important. This is a big one, and I find problematic on a lot of websites. Your goal should be to build an interface such that users don't make errors in the first place. That's a really hard problem, right? There will be an edge case that you haven't thought about or come across, and something will happen. So here, let's say, you can prevent users from putting in incorrect email addresses by just validating an email addresses they're putting in. That way they don't have to hit enter and then be told, oh, you got to go back and fix your email address. It's kind of annoying to have to do that. Even worse when all the form data gets erased and you have to go back and you just filled out a really long form, right? So this is sort of helping out the user in helping them not to make the mistakes that seem like most commonly could happen. So this is part of detecting and notifying the user. Like right here, they got notified that your password should be at least 6 characters, but it's only 4 characters. And then you want to provide options for handling an error. Like in a form example, it's a completely different way of handling it. If there's something else you're trying to do, let's say I was trying to copy paste this book or get paper by Gibson, but it already exists. Now you want to give the user the option, right? Instead of the system automatically doing something, and they can choose. You also want an easy way for people to be able to undo things, because it's like you go down a path, you want to be able to backtrack because you're like, oh, this is really not the path I want to go down. I want to come back and I want to go a different path. And your system needs to allow for things like that. An undo, like an email undo is one common way of doing that. And the reason you want to do it is because otherwise things can get pretty stressful because you're not sure, right? You just put in your credit card information, you paid for something, or the system is asking you, but you never get a confirmation. And then you're like, oh, I don't know what happened. There's no way for me to go back. I wanted to add something else to my cart, and that didn't happen because I didn't have a choice there. Like many situations where users do want to go backwards and start over. Right? So this is sort of part of also helping them recover from error. And that makes the whole experience sort of graceful, right? It's not like you're yelling, you made a mistake in their faces. You're basically saying, okay, here's an option. You just did something, but maybe you didn't want to do this. You have an option to undo it, right? Or it's like when you talk about attachments in your email and then Gmail now tells you, oh, did you actually want to attach a file? Sometimes you do and sometimes you don't, but it's a good reminder. Right. Okay, this one's also important. This is how human brains function, right? People have limited short-term memory, and this we'll look at in a few minutes is Miller's law, what it translates into. And so you want to present information in a way that is helpful, makes sense up front, right? And it's simple enough that over time, when people do it multiple times, they'll remember it. But the first time around, if you have too many things, it can get too much. Right? So you use things like memory aids. Maybe you don't want to be, just in this case, let's say, website, page to page to page differences. Sometimes the nav bar is at the top, sometimes it's on the left, sometimes at the bottom. That's clearly not something you want to do, right? Always have it at the top. Just pick a place. And there's a reason for why you want to pick the top or the left or the bottom, wherever. But point being, pick something and be consistent, and that sort of helps the user as they're browsing or using your app. The rule 8 is you want to keep the user in control. And this is, of course, something we see not happening too much on websites because the minute you load a page, some video will start talking, right? It just autoplays. A lot of websites autoplay stuff. I personally find that very annoying. I mean, if I wanted to watch it, I'll hit play. Just let me make that decision. But a lot of websites don't. Netflix, I think they did make a change about letting you turn it off, but I think they do still play. The point being, you want the user to be in control, right? They want to get something done. They are there on your website for a specific task. Just want to help them do the task and not get in their way with other extra things. And give the user the option to initiate actions. They should be in control of their own experience. You are enabling that experience. Okay. So this thing, I guess the question I was thinking about is, right, systems ideally should be predictable, but as more and more AI becomes part of these systems are also starting to do more for the user. And at what point, I guess, there's sort of like this, it's not really a conflict, I guess, but there is definitely a tension between user agency, the user being in control, versus the system helping them, and how far can that help go, or should go for that matter, right? So these are things that we'll probably start encountering more and more as we go into newer apps and systems that are more AI backed and start doing more things for us without us, which they think we need. We may or may not need, we don't know yet. Okay. Right, so here's another set of usability heuristics. Those are Ben Schneiderman. These are from the Norman Nielsen group. And this is something you'll see referenced a lot throughout this talk because they're one big group that, this whole idea of usability design comes from there for digital interfaces. The things I've highlighted in blue are things that are common with Ben Schneiderman's golden rule. So, you can see that there's many that are in common. So these are 10, Ben Schneiderman had 8, so there's only a couple that are slightly different. One of them being have an aesthetic and minimalist design, and a couple others. You want the system status visible. I mean, Ben Schneiderman talks about it slightly differently, like says the user should be in control. But same kind of idea. And system should be flexible and efficient, which means the system should allow many types of users to do the things they want to do. You should be able to undo, prevent errors, and you should meet the user's expectations, right? things that they're learning, not just from other websites, but generally things we as humans know from our experiences and living in the real world. And there's another set, Togazzini's 16 principles, but there are also sort of some overlap with guidelines, right? You want things to be consistent, you want to deal with colorblindness, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Fitts Law and some of these other things. But point being, there's, like I said earlier, there's many different guidelines, sets of guidelines and principles, and there's overlap, and some have different things, right? So you can choose to follow any one of them or none of them, but you want to start with something, and you may want to follow one of them. All right, so now let's focus a little bit on the user experience side of things. Now we talked a bunch about user interface, design guidelines, etc. Right, so here's Don Norman of the Nilsson Norman group that I just mentioned, where usability experiences started, right? So this is, if you want to read one book, you may want to read this one, The Design of Everyday Things. All right, so here are some design concepts. Now these ones are coming from Adobe. Again, they have something similar to previous ones. You got recognition over recall. Togazzini had Fitts Law. There's visibility, which Schneiderman had, and there's affordances, which we'll talk about in a minute, mental models. So like I said, again, several of these are similar. Some of them are new and more specific. All right, so mental models, all of us have our own mental models of how things work. And these come from over time, from growing up in environments that you grew up in whatever you learned, you read, you saw, all these things. And these mental models sometimes, well, according to this Universal Principles of Design book, they are based on belief, not fact, right? It's just something that you use to make sense of what's out there as you go about in your life, and they're continuously evolving as you have newer experiences. But generally, there is inertia in users' mental models. So if they expect the search icon to sort of look like what it does right now, and you make it look different, that's going to be hard, because now you're certainly not meeting the expectations, even though maybe our icon makes a lot more sense. So it's just also familiarity with things makes it harder to change people's minds. So you can, again, like I said, you either conform to what's people's mental models are about things, or you improve them. And when you improve them is where new design breakthroughs happen. Right? Jacob's law is interesting. It essentially states users spend most of the time on other sites, right? They are not going to spend 100% of the time on your app, no matter what kind of app you have. And this means they're already familiar with how things are working in all of these other apps, and they would expect yours to work at least similarly in most respects. Right? So just keep that in mind, that when you're designing, people are spending a few minutes, maybe an hour, depending on your website, but they're also spending the rest of the day on other things, other apps. Okay, so that's sort of mental models. It sort of helps you understand the user, or at least know that people have mental models, and what you're trying to do may or may not fit their mental model, right? And some of it is learning, and some of it is you designing cleverly to help them learn. Chunking is essentially breaking down your content into, as it says, chunks, because most people now skim, right? And you want to create content that is skimmable. Most of the time, the way people read a web page is sort of this F shape. You look at the title, you go down the left side, you sort of have the one arm of the F, right? So look at something in the middle and maybe something down here. And that's how people are reading. No one's reading everything on every page. So you got to keep that in mind. And that might also be a function of what device we're looking at. right? On a laptop, this page will look quite different from what it looks like on a phone, and content is going to be just distributed differently. So that's going to impact how people are reading, and you want to make it readable in different devices. Right? And chunking comes from this idea, Miller's law, is the idea that an average person can only keep 7 plus or minus 2 items in their working memory at any time. And you want to keep this in mind when you're designing, because if you have too many things for a user to remember, then it's not going to work out. Right? And again, break down the information. You sort of just want to make easy to digest smaller pieces kind of thing. This, I think, is sort of the most interesting concept. And the idea of affordance, and I'm assuming most of you have heard the term affordance, right, being used when it comes to design and other things. Affordance was the idea first introduced by J.J. Gibson in 1979 in his book, The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, right? And the idea was that all actions that can be physically possible by the properties of an object or an environment. So essentially, if you look at this visual here, right, this is a concrete pipe. What are all the possible things that someone could do with the pipe? You could roll it, of course, kick it, stand on it, sit in it, multiple things that you can do. And then there's this whole idea also of relational affordance, in the sense that if a human being is looking at a concrete pipe, the affordances are different from if a cat is looking at the same concrete pipe, right? The cat's going to do different things with it, and the human's going to do different things with it. So that means the concrete pipe affords doing of all these things, depending on who's going to be doing them. Now, Don Norman, in the book that we just saw a screenshot of, Psychology of Everyday Things, came up with this idea of perceived affordance, which is essentially the actions that a user perceives to be possible. And this is, I mean, it's a subtle difference, and it's different from actions which are actually possible. So in Gibson's approach, these actions are all possible to do with this concrete pipe, right? And in Norman's approach, which essentially applies to digital entities, these actions are perceived to be popular. Just as an example, look at this piece of text. It's blue, it's underlined. I'm expecting this to be a hyperlink, just a URL to go somewhere, but it isn't. It's just a piece of underlined text, right? So this thing afforded, or at least I perceived it to be clickable and go somewhere, but it wasn't. Does that help, I guess? Does anyone have questions about affordance in general?
No questions so far.
Okay.
As a time check, it's 7:30, but feel free to continue.
Okay, let me see how many slides left to go. Whoa. Okay, maybe I will skip to... Yeah, let's take a look at these. Right. Right. Sorry, it sort of feels abrupt, and I should have timed myself better on this. But essentially, as I was saying earlier, UX, UI could be one job, could be two jobs, could be many jobs. It just depends on who you work for, right? There's graphics designers, UI, who build the interface, the colors, the layouts, and everything else. There's the designer, UX designer, who's determining how a particular task is going to get accomplished through an app. So let's say you're ordering food using, I don't know, Uber Eats or something. How is a person going to get food delivered to their door using an app? And this is sort of the whole walkthrough path the user needs to walk to get this to happen. There's someone who's a UX writer who is writing all the text labels, the error messages, and other text content on the website. Like I said, again, could be one person, could be a separate person. There's the user researcher who determines how the entire interface works, does the studies to figure out problems, changes, and all those things. There's a prototyper who's building mock-ups and wireframes, and then there's the engineer who's building the backend system. So many of these, like I said, overlap. Sometimes they're not. One thing I wanted to bring up was this whole idea of fictional interfaces, right? Those you see in shows and movies. So if anyone is or has watched Expanse, we've seen a lot of different types of interfaces on ships used, right? And most of the time, people are using their hands to interact with these things. So this one is from Black Panther. The one on the right is Minority Report, it's an old movie. But there are companies that are designing these interfaces to be used in these shows. So these are also actual real jobs. Right. So this one, I think Black Panther was done by a company called Experience Perception. They're based out of New York. And I thought that they did a really cool job. And they also looked at a lot of research papers to see what's been done before. They built many levels of mock-ups and prototypes until they settled on what the final interface is going to look like, right? So while technically this may not work, the whole process of building the interface, the design process happened. The rest, they stopped at, the actual prototype implementation. They did let's say a visual implementation, or actually, I don't know how else they realize these things in a movie, but point being, they still have to do all the research to make it seem realistic. I kind of want to end with a couple of links to other resources if you're interested in UI UX design. So there's MIT has a class 6.831, and then Coursera also has its courses. I haven't looked at either of these. I mean, I know of the MIT class. I am not familiar with the Coursera one, but I was looking around and I found it. So can't really say, I'm not particularly endorsing any one of these. MIT's lecture notes are available for free. So, take a look, skim through those. And it's also pretty old. You can see it's 2011. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there, and then maybe people asking questions. We might come back to some of the slides as needed.
Yeah. If anyone has any questions, we can now just take some questions, and Professor Schrock can answer them here. Monsi says, what type of UX UI research are you currently involved in?
I am specifically focusing on spatial user interfaces. So right now, what is happening is, given how, right, we've had phones for a long time, and we've had websites for even longer than that. But we've had augmented reality, at least consumer level devices, for much shorter. And so we're learning from UX design experiences in non-spatial interfaces and applying those to spatial interfaces. And that's sort of like a first step, it's just a given. But once you're wearing a headset and you're interacting with your hands or a controller and you're actually walking around, you can't really have an interface that's sort of stuck in one particular physical position, right? Just like on an app, let's say the menu button is always, or the overflow menu is always top right, those 3 dots. But what is the equivalent of that in a spatial experience where you can move around? There is no concept of a fixed frame that you're looking at the world through. So we're sort of, looking at different ways of interacting with digital content in virtual and augmented reality, because text-based interfaces, while needed, or menu-based systems, and all of these things, they sort of need to be interpreted and used differently now because of now we're in this spatial environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, she says that's very interesting. Okay, we're getting some more questions. Okay, so Ethan says, are surveys, experiments common in research, or is it more theoretical?
Surveys and experiments?
Like surveys / experiments common in research.
yes, they are common not only in research, they're also very common in industry. Most everybody, like when Uber was building their Uber Eats app, and every time they add a big new feature, they actually do a user study, a user experiment, have people come in, try out those things, or give them an early version and they walk around, live with it, or something like that. So those are super important. Not only as you're designing, like let's say you're building something for the first time, but also afterwards as you're trying to improve whatever you've built.
Okay, Natalie asks, what concrete skills can we learn for UX UI internships to get an idea of what they expect?
I would say learn to use the prototyping tools. Also know how to build the actual thing. So definitely HTML, CSS, JavaScript, React, Bootstrap, be familiar with those things. And have a sense of what these design principles and guidelines are. What you'll find will set you apart from others is, everybody can learn to write code and everything else, but to be able to think critically about the design of a system comes from an understanding of the human being that you're designing for. And so familiarity with these things will help you. Also, maybe stop critiquing what's out there, right? Every time you think it's your fault when you can't figure out how to do something with an app, you may want to stop and think and whether it's really your fault, which never is. But what is the app doing incorrectly? Or what is the website doing that it should not be doing, or what should it be doing, right? So just be more critical of what you're looking at. But in terms of programming skills, I'd say those, and design skills, like some of the things we talked about, be familiar with what an affordance is and what are some principles of design and why does it even matter? Why does the user even matter, and how do users, I mean, if you want to read a couple of papers or even just Google around, you'll see how user studies are conducted. That would be helpful to know. Like, what is the process of running an experiment? How do you even design an experiment? Because you're not asking people for their opinions when you do an experiment. You're actually looking at the exact things they're doing. You don't want to know whether they like it or don't like it. You want to know what exactly is causing frustration, or what are the actual things that are happening. Does that help?
So we'll probably take just one or two more questions. But Natalie asked, do you have any resources that give exercises in programming and how to use them, or mentorship? I'd love to learn, but don't know where to get started.
Programming in general, like any kind, or something more specific like HTML or JavaScript, or anything? Okay, I guess I should look at this. Anything? Okay, so let me answer Natalie's question first. Is some of these things are more like you just Google and say how to make a website. And I think the W3 schools actually walk you through all the steps of making a website. And I think that's where you should start. It's simply put, you don't have to download anything. They have an interface for you to look at small chunks of code, test them out, edit them, and then see what the output looks like. So you can make that connection on what you're doing in code. This is what your website's going to look like if you change this tag in HTML and CSS, right? And try to understand that connection just by doing, and then build on top of that. So that's sort of more from a programming standpoint. And of course, there's prototyping tools. So I would start there. And then JavaScript has its own equivalent resources. And if you want to learn things other than, Python and all, they also have similar ways of learning just in your browser. Okay, all right. So Code Academy is Joyce is recommending that, and I think she's happy with it. So that might be one way to go. I guess I'm maybe more just DIY, but that's a good one, good resource. Okay, so let's see. I had a question from Mansi. Are there any applications of more traditional theoretical CS concepts in UI design? I guess if you start thinking about once your website starts to have a backend, and by backend I mean, you have a database, you have a lot of information that you're loading. Let's say you're building Amazon and you want to show, like, I don't know, 50 products on each page, but you want to be able to have loading times at a minimum. Then you want to definitely have some CS concepts of how backend databases work. You want to understand about other elements to be able to optimize whatever you're designing. But I mean, yes, I would say to answer your question that your interface will impact how quickly the data is fetched from your database and how much data is fetched. Because it's possible that you design an interface and the person is searching for one thing and you pull everything related to that one thing. But it's possible that you decide to only pull the top 10 things and then incrementally add the others as the user scrolls down. Right? So those are some. The idea and the concept of how much to show the user, what are the most important things, how to sort things out are important, and also a matter of design, how to render all these in your browser to show the user. And then the fact that you're working with a database, how to have that structured is more CS. Does that make sense, Monty? Okay, cool. Let's see. Next question. Okay, I know Natalie said you haven't had any classes to know what to prioritize. I'd say just start. I mean, fundamental of web design is HTML and CSS, so you got to start there and then build on top of that. Don't worry about JavaScript just yet, right? So once you understand HTML, CSS is just an add-on and helps you render, separate out the actual HTML from the design part. And then JavaScript makes the whole thing dynamic, and the React makes the whole thing even more dynamic. So these sort of all build on top of each other. Okay, right, Spencer put a link, information about what to look at, and Codecademy. Joyce, how do you see? Dorian is asking, how do you see UX and UI evolving in the future? That's a hard question because if you look at, as I was saying, if you look at any kind of fictional user interface, they're all very, you're interacting with your hands all the time. It's all in front of your face. And those kinds of inputs are exhausting, actually. I mean, imagine all day, instead of using your phone, your hands down here or resting on your laptop keyboard, this is what you're doing all day. This is practically, it's just not feasible, right? I mean, we are certainly not evolving very quickly. So I think that interfaces are probably going to go not the route that we see in media right now, but maybe a bit more multimodal when it's a combination of offloading some effort to a backend AI. So let's say a speech interface does something. I ask the system to show me XYZ. And then I ask the system something else. And then I can maybe touch it and make it bigger because I want to look at it closer. So now I'm using a gesture. And then I want to turn around and look left, and the system knows my gaze, or it's watching my gaze, and then shows me the zoomed up version somewhere else on the screen. And I kind of see more of that happening, I think. I mean, until maybe we get chips embedded in our brains and then everything just happens to direct. We don't need to see things, then we just have things in our heads. Maybe that's too far down the road, but in my opinion, maybe. And maybe I'm mostly thinking from a spatial interfaces point of view, because in VR you can, you're in this other environment that you fully control, and you can track gaze, and you can have hand gestures because you can detect them, and you can have speech input. All of these things sort of fall into place in terms of input modalities. And maybe my viewpoint comes more from that than how phone UI might evolve over time. I mean, I think ultimately everything relies on making the user's life easy, and that's not going to change. And if you look at the new PlayStation 5 user interface, right, everything is about speed, about switching from one game to another, having the ability to talk to your friends right as you pause a game and the interface shows at the bottom. And none of these things were possible before, and a lot of it is because just required a lot different kind of computational power, but the kinds of things that people do with games also now has changed, right? People play with friends, and back when gaming started, it was just single person games, and people want to take screenshots, people want to stream. So the interfaces sort of kind of evolve. Everything evolves sort of as a system, right? Hardware can enable new things. So let's say faster loading times. There's software that evolves. People want to do different things. So social is evolving simultaneously or changing. And all of that feeds into the design of what's going to happen. So I don't know. Too long an answer to a short question. Sorry about that. But it's a little bit hard to say, I guess.
All right, so we're actually going to close here just because we don't want to hold people too long. But if anyone has any more questions, you can either direct it to me or our Slack channel. Joyce, if you could link our Slack channel, that'd be good. And so you could ask those questions there, and I'll relay it over to Professor Straw to get you an answer later.
Okay, yeah, I'll do my best to answer. So
thank you so much also.
thanks, everybody.
Joyce, if you want to share your screen really quickly. Okay, just really quickly. If you want to connect with us in the future, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Slack. There you can find resources, opportunities, and just connect with a group of designers. Our next event will be an intro to Adobe Illustrator, which will be hosted by our design team. Illustrator is really cool because you can learn how to make SVGs, vector graphics, which are super useful in like website design as well, because you can use it for logos, branding, web animation. Yeah, so that'd be really cool to look into if you're interested in web design. And just finally, thank you to Professor Straw and everyone for coming out. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or feedback, you can fill out that feedback form. It's a Google form. And as well as sign up for any emails on our mailing list. But yeah, that concludes our workshop. Thank you so much for coming, everybody.